Hello and welcome back to Meet Me at Midnight. This is episode 2. I'm so excited. I got a lot of really good feedback on the first episode, which if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it. All of the episodes are now streaming on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Samsung Podcasts, Podcast Index, Listen Notes, RSS, and YouTube. If you have been following any of my social medias, you know that for a minute there it was only on SoundCloud. There were some issues with distribution, but that's all been taken care of now. Also, if you want to get notified of when new episodes release, subscribe, rate if you have time. I appreciate any kind of feedback. With all of that said, let's dig in. I've got a lot of information coming your way, so buckle in, boys and girls. It's going to be a bumpy ride. This week, we are doing a true crime episode about John Wayne Gacy. If you haven't heard of him, well, good luck. It's going to be a lot. So let's talk about his origin story. So he was born March 17th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a really bad home. His father was abusive and an alcoholic. Gacy's father also beat his wife, as well as Gacy and his sisters, with a razor strap if they misbehave. I had no idea what a razor strap was, so I had to look it up. So razor strap is a flexible strip of material used to sharpen and polish the blade of like a straight razor or a knife. So I'd imagine if it can sharpen those things, it's probably going to hurt like a bitch. So no fun at all, really. And then Gacy was also born with a congenital heart condition, so he wasn't very active as a child. Gacy's father felt like he was a failure and nicknamed him Sissy. Which is kind of fucked up for your dad to do, but he was clearly already a horrible father to begin with, so no surprise there. With the defect, Gacy experienced frequent seizures and blackouts and was unable to make friends in school and was alienated due to his condition. So definitely not a good home life. I feel like there is definitely some tell to how somebody's childhood is. Like, there's some indication to why they are the way they are now, to say the least. And then between the ages of 6 and 10, it was reported that a teenage daughter of one of his mother's friends undressed and played with him. So really this was like the start of his psychosexual history. And then he was also molested by a family friend between the ages of 10 and 12. So starting at this age, Gacy was accused of fondling a young girl, but nothing ended up coming of it. There was no, proof or report or anything. And then a little bit later in childhood, Gacy realized that he was gay, but obviously at this time, it was the 1940s, 1950s. It was a very taboo thing to be homosexual, and he struggled greatly with it, which, I mean, I get, even nowadays, people still struggle with it, so hate to relate to a serial killer, but, I get it. He pretended to be straight for the entirety of his life because of this. He struggled in school in general, dropped out of high school, and cut contact with his family, and ended up moving to Vegas. In Vegas, he got a job as a mortuary assistant, and he lived in a funeral home. So since he lived there, his boss knew he had nowhere to stay, so he let him live there. And since he was there by himself at night, he used to undress the male dead bodies and would talk to them, as well as tried to have sex with them. I mean, if that's not a real, true turning point to his psychological behavior, I don't know what is. So we have a little bit of necrophilia. The funeral director, after this had gone on for so long, the funeral director ended up getting suspicious of Gacy, so he quit and then moved back to Chicago. When he was back in Chicago, he went to Northwestern Business College and then moved to Springfield, Illinois to work as a salesman and manager at a shoe company. And then it was there, not at the shoe company, but in Springfield, it was there that he met his first wife, Marilyn. After meeting Marilyn, they moved to Waterloo, Iowa, and then her father owned several KFC restaurants in that area. So they moved there so Gacy could become the manager at those restaurants. And then Gacy and his first wife, Marilyn, also had 2 children, Michael, who was born in February of 1966, and then Christine, who was born in March of 1967. And then here's where we start getting into, like, his crimes, like, true crimes. So it really, I guess you should say crimes against the living, since his previous crimes were against the dead at the funeral home. But so in 1968, which is 1 year after his daughter was born, he was convicted of a sexual assault of 2 teenage boys. In 1967, Gacy had assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees Jr., who was the son of a local politician. And then the official crime was listed as non-consensual oral sodomy. So basically non-consensual oral. And then Gacy also attempted to assault the 16-year-old Edward Lynch as well. In November of 1968, Gacy had pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy for Voorhees Jr., but pleaded not guilty to the other charges of attempted assault. He was convicted of the sodomy on December 3rd, 1968, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Not that I can blame the woman, but the same day as Gacy was sentenced, his wife filed for divorce. It was granted, and she got everything in the divorce. Home, property, and sole custody of their 2 kids. Thank God she got out when she did, because it only gets worse from here. Divorce was finalized in September of 1969, and then he never heard from his wife Marilyn or the children again. The crazy part is, after assaulting 2 teenage boys, he only ended up serving 18 months before being released in 1970 on good behavior. So he was a model prisoner, and they released him way early into his 10-year sentence. After he got out in 1971, he started a construction business called PDM Contractors and became a Democratic precinct captain as well. He had in later interviews said that this decision may have been a way to piss off his dad, who had always made fun of his interest in politics. And he was quoted saying, "And maybe it was a way to get acceptance. I was always looking for acceptance because my dad made me feel like I was never good enough." End quote. Like, tough shit, dude. We've all got problems. I get... Actually, I don't get it. Never mind. Forget what I was going to say. I don't get it. I don't understand your crimes at all. Thank you. Regarding PDM Contractors, so most of his employees were high school students and young men who he often propositioned them for sex and sometimes under threat. So, easy pool of victims to pull from, since he had his own company where he hired whoever he liked. So he hired who he liked. That same year, Gacy was arrested again on sexual assault charges, but they were dropped. They were so close to having them, and then everything else could have been avoided, but no. And then also in 1971, he got engaged to Carol Hoff, who he had met in high school and then reconnected with in 1972, and then they got married. He was very well liked in his community. He organized cultural gatherings and was active in political organizations. He was also a member of the Jolly Joker Clown Club, which is creepy as hell. He performed in clown attire and makeup at children's parties, charity fundraisers, and other events. His alter egos were Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown. I'm gonna put some pictures up on my socials with what he looked like, and I get why the older generation is afraid of clowns, why they all have a fear of clowns, because if clowns look like that, when I was a kid, I would be afraid of them too. Gacy also later had made a comment in an interview that, quote, "clowns can get away with murder." I mean, he almost did. He really almost did. So moving on, January 1972, Gacy lured 16-year-old Timothy McCoy to his house for sex. Timothy was a employee of his. At this point, Gacy is 30 years old and married to his second wife, and this is a 16-year-old boy. So the following morning after having sex with him, he woke up to find McCoy standing in the doorway with a knife. Gacy rushed the kid and got the knife away and stabbed him to death. And it was at this moment that Gacy realized that he got sexual gratification from killing, and had also said that that's when he'd realized that death was the ultimate thrill. In reality, the reason why McCoy had a knife was because he had made breakfast for himself and Gacy and had come to wake him up and just happened to have a knife in his hand. Lucky for him. Another victim of Gacy's was John Butkovich. He's an 18-year-old PDM employee again, who Gacy lured to his house with the ruse of discussing overdue pay. He tricked him into putting handcuffs on and then strangled him to death. So handcuffs ended up becoming one of his usual signatures. He would tell his victims that he was showing them a magic trick. I mean, he was a clown, so I guess he could get away with it. He wasn't dressed like a clown when he was doing these things, but I feel like with the kind of personality and charisma he must have had to get away with this for so long, being like, hey, let me show you a magic trick, put these handcuffs on, I guess that would have worked, I guess. And most of Gacy's victims, they also found fabric stuffed down their throats, like underwear, socks, rags, and t-shirts. His signature ended up becoming binding, torturing, raping, and then strangling his victims. John's parents were extremely suspicious of Gacy and called the police more than 100 times, wanting them to investigate further. They obviously never did because he was able to kill in the same manner. So some of Gacy's other cases, he had been accused of rape by 2 more young men by the mid-1970s, and he was questioned by police about it, as well as the disappearances of others. Also in the mid-70s, Gacy referred to these years as his cruising years. He committed most of his murders during this time period as well, and his victims were buried on his property underneath the crawl space of his house. So this leads us to Gregory Godzik, who was another 17-year-old PDM employee who was ordered to dig trenches in the crawl space by Gacy. The kid had informed his family about digging these trenches, and Gacy had later informed the police that these were his graves. So Godzik, of course, ended up going missing as well after digging these trenches. So he literally dug his own grave, which is incredibly sad to think about. Godzik's family had called Gacy regarding his whereabouts, and he told Godzik's family that he had confided that he had planned to run away from home, so they did not press the issue. They did not look any further into it. If I was a parent, that would not have been good enough for me. I would have called the police, had Gacy investigated, but I guess they trusted him enough to be like, okay, well, if he says he was running away, then I guess he ran away. Several more young boys and men were killed, and one victim survived. His name is Robert Donnelly. He's a 19-year-old college student, and Gacy abducted him from a Chicago bus stop, brought him to his house, raped and tortured him. He, if you don't want to hear any details, skip 20 seconds or something. He dunked his head repeatedly in a bathtub until he passed out, and then performed fake executions with a gun loaded with blanks. So severe psychological and physical torture. Donnelly ended up begging Gacy for death, but Gacy let him go and instead politely asked him not to tell anybody. And then, of course, Donnelly reported Gacy to the police, as one would, and then when investigated, Gacy had told the police that it was consensual sex slavery, and the police believed him. They believed him without any investigation. And then, of course, another victim was killed a month later. And then in 1975, Carol, Gacy's second wife, asked for a divorce. She had argued with him, believing that he was cheating on her. Little did she know, man. Boy, was he. Then in March of 76, the divorce was finalized. And then here's a little, like, creepy tidbit. I found that for the 4 years of their marriage, Carol had in an interview later said that she had smelled and ignored the awful stench of the house, which was coming up from the dead bodies that were stuffed into the crawl space beneath her. So she had been smelling decomposing bodies for 4 years and didn't like think twice about it, like had just ignored it. And then in 1978, Gacy's crawl space had no more space available for bodies, so at this point he started disposing of bodies in the Des Plaines River, and he dumped them from a bridge on Interstate 55. At the end of 1978, in December, 15-year-old Robert Peist went missing, and this is the beginning of the end right here. Peist had told his mother that he was going to meet Gacy, and then when he went missing, his mom filed a police report that led to the investigation of him. So when the police showed up, several suspicious items were discovered. They saw police badges, hypodermic needles, pornos, and other out-of-place items, which were later found to be like trophies from Gacy's victims that he just left laying around his house. And then a long surveillance and investigation period of Gacy resulted from seeing those items, and Gacy knew the police were watching his house and would invite them in to use the restroom. One officer took him up on the offer. I would not have done that. I would squat on the side of the road, whatever it took to not go in that house, but one officer took him up on it and noticed the smell of decomposing bodies coming up through the heating vent. So this event was enough for the police to obtain a search warrant for Gacy's house. And after they got the search warrant, that led to the discovery of a receipt that belonged to Peist. That timeline contradicted Gacy's statement, saying that he had no contact with Peist the day that he went missing. The investigation also led to the police discovering the trenches filled with bodies in the crawl space, and Gacy was then arrested and confessed to killing around 30 people. In 1979, the following year, Gacy's house was destroyed looking for more evidence. When that was completed, it was demolished and a new house was built there. In case anybody wants to look it up on Google Earth or whatever, the address is 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, Norwood Park, Illinois. And then a weird quote from one of the demolition workers was that if the devil's alive, he lived here. I think this was like such an odd thing. Like I couldn't find anything about why the demolition worker like was compelled to say that, but that's kind of spooky. That place is definitely haunted. Like it's literally a burial ground. It's probably 100% haunted. I would never live there, even though it's a new house. And then Gacy's trial began in February of 1980. He had confessed to the crime, so the only discussion really was whether or not Gacy would be declared insane and committed to a state facility or gone to prison. He spent hundreds of hours undergoing psychological testing. Gacy had tried to convince them that he had a multiple personality disorder. So the 4 personalities were the contractor, the clown, the politician, and the police officer, who was named Bad Jack, and said that this personality hated homosexuality and viewed Gacy's victims as scum, weak, stupid, and degraded. So basically, he's trying to blame all of the murders he committed on this one police officer personality named Bad Jack, and saying that all his other ones were good. And I mean, he would have it better in a state mental facility versus a prison, so he's definitely trying to get out of it. He ended up pleading not guilty. Even though he had confessed to the crimes originally, he pleaded not guilty when the time came, and then the case went to trial for the 33 murder charges. On March 12th, 1980, after a short deliberation of the jury, they found Gacy guilty of committing the 33 murders. Henceforth was known as one of the most ruthless serial killers in American history. Even though he was convicted of only 33 murder, those are only the known and confirmed cases. It's believed that he's committed way more murders and assaults as well that were never tied to him. Just like the guy Robert Donnelly, who was let go by Gacy. He reported Gacy, but I'm sure there were plenty that did not report him. I mean, if you think about the time, like it was still very taboo to be gay. So like if any of these people were lured to Gacy's house to have sex with him and they did and then things went south, it's either report like their assailant and like come out as gay or just keep it hidden. And most people seem to have kept it hidden since not many more assaults or murders were tied to him. And then Gacy was imprisoned at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester for 14 years, and during this time, he appealed the sentence multiple times. Even though he confessed to all the murders originally, he later denied guilt on all charges. He even had a phone number set up for people to call so that they could listen to a 12-minute pre-recorded message declaring his innocence, which is absolutely crazy to me. Like, maybe he is insane. I mean, to some degree he has to be, but like maybe he is really insane because he just kept pleading like not guilty, not guilty, not guilty to anybody who would listen. While Gacy was imprisoned, he started studying the visual arts, especially painting, and some of his paintings were exhibited at the Chicago Art Gallery. Most of his paintings were depictions of himself, actually, as like Pogo the Clown. And then in 2017, his paintings, as well as crime scene photos from the trial, were auctioned off. So all of his paintings and stuff are still out there. Guaranteed you've probably seen like one of his most famous ones, which I'll also post. Before I had even like learned about Gacy, I had seen this painting before. So I'm sure some of you guys have as well. Then, in October of 1993, Gacy attempted to make his final appeal of innocence. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear it. They were like, nah, we're good. You're guilty. Thanks, though. We don't want to waste our time. Instead of listening to his appeal, they set an execution date for him. Before Gacy's execution, he said that the victims' families would get no comfort from his death and accused the state of murdering him instead. His reported last words were, "Kiss my ass." On May 10th, 1994, at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Though there were only 33 confirmed kills that were tied to him, more people were definitely killed. Of the human remains found at Gacy's house, 8 of those bodies couldn't be identified. So with new methods for identifying bodies being developed over the years, almost 20 years after Gacy's execution, another person's remains were identified. In 2017, Cook County authorities used DNA evidence to identify 16-year-old James Jimmy Byron Atkinson. He had been missing since 1976. In 2021, 4 years later, DNA testing identified another victim of those 8 bodies that were unidentified from under his house, which was a 21-year-old Francis Wayne Alexander, who had also disappeared in 1976. I'm sure moving forward, like they're still trying to identify bodies. There's still at least 6 that haven't been identified that were found under his house. And that doesn't even include if any washed up on that river that he was throwing bodies in, and things like that. After Gacy's death, his body was cremated and reportedly split between his parents. It's not really confirmed, though. Nobody really knows what happened to his ashes. His brain, however, was kept intact for scientific study. So a psychiatrist named Helen Morrison, who was a witness for the defense in Gacy's trial, she believed he was legally insane, even though the jury rejected the insanity defense. But she was given Gacy's brain after he died to study, and she supposedly keeps it in her basement. Does she keep other brains in her basement? I don't think I could sleep to have a serial killer's brain just like chilling below me. Also, I think it's kind of poetic that his last, like, true, like, physical remains of his body is in a basement, like, underground, just like his victims were for so long. So that is, like, some sort of, like, poetic justice and universal karma, if you will. Gacy's wives remained out of the public eye, and very little is known about them and what happened with them after Gacy's death, similar to Gacy's children. They stayed hidden and are presumed to be alive and well with normal lives of their own today. They would be in their 50s now. Honestly, it's all just so depressing and horrific. And then, like, kind of a weird thought that trips me out is, like, when I think about how recent this was. Like, Gacy's son was born the same year as my dad, so they're the same age. And it's just really weird to think about, like, this wasn't that long ago. This really wasn't that long ago at all. Like, a lot of people that I know lived through this. Anyways, thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you don't follow my socials, I'm on Twitter, or X as it's called now, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. My handle's MMAM_the podcast. Also, I have an email if you guys wanted to send any topic suggestions or spooky stories of your own that you want told. The email is on those socials, but I'll give it to you here. It's mmamthepodcast@gmail.com. And then, like I kind of mentioned through the podcast, I'll post some pictures of Gacy and his family, as well as like his house and paintings and things like that. I'll post his mugshot too. And then new episodes coming out every Friday morning at midnight. Again, thank you. I received so much support on the first episode, and you guys have no idea how much it means. But I will meet you all at midnight next week. Bye.